Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now I love an old Alienware computer and this 2014 X51 R2 is no exception. These days you can pick some of these second-hand machines up for less than the price of a modern entry-level home PC, though it can still be quite easy to overpay for one because of the brand name alone. Originally, this model retailed anywhere from $699 to $1599 in US dollars, with the highest end offering packing a Core i7 and GTX 960 into the small form factor chassis. The price of each config wasn't set in stone and the systems could be customised to your liking. I couldn't find any details regarding other countries' prices. As of the week prior to the upload of this video, this entry-level model cost me just over £200 here in the UK. So while the answer to the question, can a 6-year-old Alienware X51 R2 game in 2020 may have one very specific outcome for this configuration in particular, it may vary depending on which one you buy. But let's see what this thing can do, shall we? So starting with the exterior, and I've always enjoyed the design of these systems, traditionally featuring far bulkier and heavy enclosures, particularly in their older days, this small form factor design is far lighter and sleeker than not just systems of many years gone by, but newer Alienware setups too. The light up Alien head and side panels are always a nice touch as well. Now I'm not an Alienware or Dell spokesman or anything like that despite my enthusiasm, I'm just passionate about older technology, and finding machines like this on the used market that were once way out of my price range for a fraction of their original RRP is just exciting, even if these machines don't hold up all too well anymore. And that of course brings us on to the specifications. If you opted for a higher end GTX 960 or R9 series GPU along with an i7 back in the day, then you'd probably still be having a 30 FPS plus experience in a lot of newer games. Inside this one, however, things probably won't hold up all too well. For the processor, we have an Intel Core i3-4150 clocked at 3.5 GHz. This is a dual-core hyper-threaded chip and honestly it still holds up fairly well in 2020. You won't have any trouble with day-to-day computing, put it that way, but some CPU-intensive tasks like editing in Premiere Pro, for example, could prove quite sluggish. This processor is paired with 8 GB of dual-channel DDR3 clocked at 1600 MHz. More than enough back in 2014, but probably the minimum I'd suggest for gaming in 2020. A DVD drive is always a welcome inclusion too, especially if like me you still own some games on disc, and although a 256GB SSD was an option for this build, R1 has a single 1TB hard drive. The biggest issue with this machine, like a lot of pre-builts, is that the graphics card has aged far worse than the processor. The GTX 745 inside this thing was never blazingly fast half a decade ago, so nowadays I'm imagining a pretty horrific gaming experience. That being said, we'll test the system as it is, and then talk about both the upgrade options and limitations a little later on. So what you'll probably notice throughout our gameplay benchmark tests here is that the Core i3 processor is being held back by the GTX 745. The GTX 745 is the 4GB variant, but it does feature DDR3 memory, and as such it does fall quite short of maintaining suitable frame rates in a lot of games. That being said, 30 FPS at 720p should be doable, and in Crysis Remastered here to start with, our gameplay experience isn't too bad, and luckily the game still looks fairly good with the lowest settings. Now you could probably put together a better system for the same money on the used market that would provide you with more than 30 frames per second at a low resolution like this. That being said, the 745 certainly did better throughout today's tests than I imagined it would first of all. GTA 5 is a fine example of one of those games. We were seeing at least 40 frames per second at full HD, albeit with the normal settings. The game still looks good, but don't forget that it came out around the same time on PC as this computer was actually released, so I was expecting it to achieve more than 30 frames per second. Now the remake of Mafia or Mafia Definitive Edition is a title that can look really good at high settings but also perform rather badly with lower end hardware, and here with the GTX 745, we were seeing close to 30 frames per second at 720p, though there were certainly some situations where this figure dropped quite a bit, and overall I'd have to say that this isn't really playable. Another example whereby 720p and the lowest settings just isn't low enough is in Red Dead Redemption 2, where we were seeing very similar frame rates to that of Mafia. Now to some extent, and in some open areas you will see 30 FPS plus, so it may be acceptable for some of you out there, but in the long run and in terms of an overall average, I can't consider this playable due to the fact that during action sequences, things like that, you are going to suffer frame rate wise, and it's going to hinder the overall experience. Although a lower resolution would be best for Rainbow Six Siege, I found that 1080p with the low settings actually gave us 30 plus FPS when using this combination of components. Now the i3 and 745 do of course impose restrictions within certain games, but something else to add is that the 8 gigs of RAM can also prove problematic in those more demanding titles, but with a CPU and GPU combination like this, I wouldn't worry about going with 16 gigs at all. Let's talk about upgrade options. There are a couple of things you can do, however there is one significant limiting factor with the X51 R2. So accessing the insides of this machine is as simple as removing the side panel with one screw and then undoing the 2 screws of this silver graphics card caddy here, so that we can access the other internals. From there you can upgrade the processor all the way up to I believe an i7-4790, and you can add a graphics card of your choice that runs with 2 6-pin connectors. Now I say of your choice, but you will actually be quite limited because of one thing. This is the 180 watt power brick. Now there is no internal PSU with the Alienware, you just get this laptop style adapter here. This is a 180 watt unit, and so you can only upgrade to a graphics card that is suitable to run with this. You can buy a 330 watt upgraded power brick, and I've seen people run 1060s in these Alienwares, but I decided to run my GTX 1050 Ti inside this thing because not only does it not require any external power, but it shouldn't put too much pressure on the system as a whole. And I'd imagine that if you added something like a 1050 Ti, you could then also upgrade the CPU a little bit too. Maybe even an i7 if it's a low power option. If we take 2 of the most demanding games I tested, starting with Red Dead Redemption 2, you can see that a switch to the 1050 Ti whilst keeping the i3 in the system does do wonders for our frame rate at 720p. In fact, we were even able to turn things up to 1080p with the high texture quality and still retain a very respectable figure in terms of the average frame rate here. The same can be said for Mafia, and actually this seems like it's more demanding. 720p once again with the 1050 Ti gives us some welcome improvements in terms of the frame rate over the original 745, and if we move to 1080p with the medium settings, again we see a plus 30 FPS average and the experience is a lot better. I like the idea of buying an older X51 R2 entry-level Alienware, but practically it doesn't really make too much sense unless you can find one for cheap, or you just want to buy one for the sake of upgrading and seeing what you can do with it. By the time you've bought one of these and then made necessary upgrades so that it can play newer games, you may as well have just purchased a better PC to begin with, although it certainly is a nice small form factor system if you're not looking at doing anything too intensive in 2020. And don't forget, you could buy one of these on the used market for cheaper than you could buy a new home PC if you really don't want to do much on it. But as for gaming, well, it really isn't that great anymore. So there we go. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like on it down below, leave a dislike if you didn't, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, let me know if you've ever owned one of these or if you do own one of these still, and hopefully I'll see you all in the next one.